So during the break, there is a question that emerged about safe zones. What are safe zones and where are they safe? And so just before we kick off in the second part, I want Jerome and Nathan to come up and address that question as far as what are safe zones and are they safe?
It's a good question, and part of the question is, what do you mean by a safe zone? As I said earlier, there's a constitutional right that all children have for a public education, and we can push on that. So if ICE wants to come and start doing immigration enforcement actions on schools, we push against that by saying you may have an enforcement right, but these students also have a constitutional right to an education. So that gives us some ground to argue in court if it comes to that. And what we've done in DPS is we've created a process by which if any school leader or school employee or district employee is approached by ICE or immigration officials requesting documents, information, or access to a student, they have to call my office, and they'll either talk to me or one of my lawyers, and we will walk them through the process to see if the immigration official is acting within the law and if we are legally required to cooperate. And if we're not legally required to cooperate, our Board of Education and our superintendent have both been very clear that we will not cooperate unless legally required to. Now, what does legally required to, what does that mean? We haven't had to test that out in court yet. Hopefully we don't have to, because one of the things we wanted to do from the beginning was to get some clarity from Homeland Security as to what approach they would take to a memo or guidance that was issued during the Obama administration, which is called the Sensitive Locations Guidance, which basically is guidance from the leaders of Homeland Security to the employees that says there are certain locations where immigration actions should not take place. That's schools, hospitals, and churches. And we wanted to get some clarity on that. After the election, it was unclear to us whether or not the Obama administration was going to continue to abide by that guidance, which is just administrative guidance, which they could pull. And we were able to, through Congressman Perlmutter, get directly from the Secretary Kelly, the Secretary of Homeland Security, his commitment, it's verbal, but it's his commitment that guidance will stay in place. And so we felt good about that. We wish we would have had it in writing, but we didn't. But at least we have from the top a commitment that says schools will continue to be a safe place, churches and hospitals will also. So that means unless there's exigent circumstances, immigration officials should not come into schools to go after any of our students or employees, we would argue, and they shouldn't go after our documents either. And so we feel strong that we would go to court and say, no, you shouldn't be doing these routine actions in our court because, one, there's this guidance, and if the administration is not following its own guidance, we could still argue the policy behind it. And then there's the constitutional right. And on the constitutional right, what we would argue is these types of actions are infringing, are prohibiting our students, or it's infringing on their rights to exercise that constitutional right. So we feel good about that. But there is still some uncertainty because we don't know how a court would respond in that case. But at least in our district, what we've said is there's a process. It has to come through our legal office, and we will test to make sure that we are legally required. And if not legally required, we won't cooperate.
Okay. Nathan.
Yeah, I think you pretty well covered it there. I mean, there's not a single definition of a safe zone, and there's certainly not a one agreed definition on what a sanctuary city is. I mean, so there are some disputed terms here, but that particular guidance to ICE that came from 2011, identifying sensitive areas that ICE will not go, including schools, churches, and hospitals. So far, ICE is following that. We hope that will continue. That's certainly something we advocate for, is that would continue. There are some other places we think ought to be treated that way, such as courthouses. It's a real problem that ICE has not been treating courthouses as places that they won't go, and that's been a dispute in California and some other places. But at least so far, that has held up. But it could conceivably change, and that's where the uncertainty comes in. We're certainly strongly advocating that that be expanded and not contracted.
Okay. And if you have more questions, these two will be up later, and write them down on those cards, and we can direct those questions to them. So here we have another panel, and I'm excited to introduce these folks. You know, our panelists that we've had today, they're my heroes, and they're folks that are just doing extraordinary work out there on behalf of our residents here in this region. First, to my left, I want to introduce Nicole Meliku, who is the Executive Director of the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition, known as CIRC. Okay, and then next to Nicole, we have Celesta Martinez, who's a bilingual community organizer with Together Colorado. And next to Celesta, we have Melissa Thiessen, who is the Managing Director for the African Community Center. And lastly, but not least by any means, we have David Quinones, who is the Deputy Chief of the Denver Police Department and a colleague of mine. And so let's give our panel a warm welcome here. So just the first question, what we're going to do is I'm going to go through some questions, and then in the last half hour we'll ask the questions that you've provided, and I have some of them right here. The first question, so we talked about a little bit as far as the framing of the landscape and what we're seeing, but my question is to you personally. You know, what are you seeing as far as from your viewpoint in the landscape, and what are some of those really pressing issues that seem to be coming to the surface from your viewpoint? So Nicole, did you want to start us off, and then we'll just go right down the line?
So I think the biggest thing that we're seeing as a coalition, we have 65 organizations that are members across the state. We're seeing just a resurgence of and sort of a real desire for folks to have conversations with their elected officials at the municipal level around the discussion of sanctuaries. So, you know, what does it mean to live in a safe city where police and ICE do not collaborate? Sort of folks wanting to see how they can make that possible in their city. We've had some really great stakeholder conversations with major cities, including Denver, and really moving that out from the center of Denver and out from there. So there are smaller communities like in Grand Junction or in Montrose, Colorado, where even something like passing a resolution so that their city is a safe city is a huge jump for them. And so we're seeing a lot of people want to have the conversation around what it means to live in a safe city. We're seeing insurmountable fear from our immigrant community and people who are very hungry to know their rights in this time. And we're seeing just an unprecedented level of community partners coming forward wanting to bring the Know Your Rights curriculums to their organizations, to their institutions. And so not only are we organizing around policy and advocacy like we've typically done for the last 15 years, really what it's looking like is just a massive sort of campaign to really get the information out to community members' hands so that they can protect themselves from deportation or detention by simply knowing their rights. The other thing that we've seen is a groundswell of support from our what we call our receiving community, so folks who may have not had a whole lot of knowledge around immigration or immigrant integration wanting to come forward and find ways to support within their local communities. And so that looks like community conversations in church basements, that looks like the beginning of sanctuary conversations in small congregations across the state. And it looks very different than in the past, where this was a small sort of subset of folks who were really interested in the issue, kind of thinking about it in a very micro-focused way, but now with the sort of issue coming out to the front of the national discourse, people really wanting to figure out what is the message, what kind of Colorado do we want to be for all members of our community, including immigrants and refugees. And so I think, you know, the silver lining is the fact that there are a lot of people wanting to help, and I think our community partners just sort of connecting the dots to the services that you may provide, whether that's health or education, really understanding how the issue of immigration sort of intersects with the other work that you do. And so I think that's a critical part of the conversation that's new.
Very good. I want to come back to that question as far as what folks can do to help before we end here. Celesta.
Yes. So for Together Colorado, we organize communities of faith to lead grassroots campaigns that work towards systemic change. And so in part of my work in leading Catholic congregational outreach, I've seen a really on the ground a desire amongst communities to be further integrated. You know, many of our congregations, because of language barriers and other things, are not intentionally, but in some way structured in segregation. And so I've seen a hunger on both sides of, you know, folks from the Latino community or non-English speaking communities having a desire, as well as English speakers having a desire to be in further relationship with one another, to really understand how better to show up, right, and be a true community. And part of our work that we do for immigrant rights, Together Colorado works on a series of other issues, but one of the campaigns that we've actually partnered with the Colorado Immigrant Rights Coalition for quite some time is the driver's license campaign. In 2013, our state was successful in passing legislation that allows for all immigrants, whether or not they have status, to have access to a driver's license, which is hugely significant because we saw back in 2008 that of the 8,000 people who were deported, 63% of those folks were due to driving without a license. And as we look at two other folks in our community who are currently facing deportation proceedings, Jeanette Visquera, as well as a clear example as to how, you know, deportation should never be a consequence of a traffic violation, right, for someone who's trying to care and provide for their community. And especially with the threats that we saw early on in this administration towards DACA, the repeal of DACA would then leave our 33,000 DACA recipients in Colorado with no pathway to renewing a driver's license because they have been issued a valid Social Security, which was a drafting error in the overlook of the original passing of the legislation for driver's licenses. So we've worked really hard over this past few years to develop strategic relationships at the legislature. We were successful in negotiations for increased spending authority for the program from $500,000 to $1.5 million, and are anticipating that that will expand access, and we're very hopeful for that of rural communities, which is a huge triumph right now. There's only 3 offices available for the entire state. So all that being said, we see structural reforms such as working on this driver's license program and working on policies that disentangle the relationship between local law enforcement and our immigration system as crucial. You know, this morning alone, I received a call about someone's partner getting picked up at probation. Being compliant, right, with their probation hearing, and immigration showing up dressed in plain clothes, unannounced, and just because her partner went to the restroom, detaining her partner, and then now in this complicated process and feeling very alone. And these are things that we're seeing happen every day. As far as my work on the ground, I know that I've been more apt to answer every call on my phone because of that reality, and it has everything to do with the criminalization our communities are experiencing. And I think the last thing that I would say to this is, you know, the lack of access to healthcare or the participation in showing up for healthcare appointments. We've also seen that decrease, as well as, you know, children with undocumented parents also not showing up as much for school. And this is not a way for us to live as a community. This is not, you know, a way for us to live as Coloradans. I don't believe that's what, you know, we stand for. And so those are all things to take into consideration, as well as when we talk about policy reform or know your rights trainings. This is why that work is so crucial.
Very good. Melissa, what are you seeing?
So at the African Community Center, we are one of 3 refugee resettlement agencies in Colorado. So our job is to welcome refugees into our community and help them build safe, sustainable lives here. So what I am seeing is a lot of the we're still seeing refugees. I think that's the number one thing. We are still seeing refugees arrive into the state of Colorado. We are still welcoming them, and we are still following the same process that we always have. As Kit was mentioning earlier, it's something that has come to the surface recently, and so we are sort of in the limelight, which we historically have not been. So refugees are coming. I would say they're coming with a bit more fear than they came with in the past. Following one of the executive orders that came out related to refugee resettlement, we had two community meetings, actually, one after each one, and several of the questions were about rights. They were about their children in schools getting bullied. They were about their safety as individuals. They were about would they get deported. And again, these are folks who are here fully documented. They are here legally. So our answer was no. According to law as it stands now, you will not be deported, of course, unless there is some egregious crime. So we've been facing a lot of those new challenges, I would say, in our certainty and uncertainty with various laws and what could change. We've seen a big uptick in the number of people interested in refugee resettlement and those who want to help. So while we have seen a bit more uncertainty within the refugee community, we've seen a lot of certainty within our community in wanting to help welcome these newcomers. So that's been a really positive piece of the last several months. In the months, in about 5 months of our prior fiscal year, we had 172 volunteers show up for orientation, and this fiscal year we had 500 in the same time frame. So I think that's a good indication of the change we're seeing in the community. I think I'll stop there.
And Chief, when you go and answer this question, one of the myths that we had on the 3 questions was about officers during a stop, and if you can incorporate what DPD's approach is in that, and then proceed into the, what else you're seeing.
Absolutely. So it's through policy and practice that we stress to the officers that immigration enforcement belongs to the federal government. That is not something that the local police should take, and they take that to heart. So we have really no reason to ask for somebody's immigration status. Now, would we ask for, if we contact a foreign national for their country of origin? Yes. But that is because some countries and some individuals want their embassies to be notified, but we do not get into the immigration status of that individual. As far as what have we seen, this is the 4th symposium, panel, or meeting that I have participated in personally since the start of the year. So obviously there's some fear and concerns amongst the community. The chief has participated in several himself, and our message is always the same to the community. Nothing has changed for us. We need community participation. We need the community to help us fulfill our mission of crime prevention through partnerships with the community. We can't have any segment of the community being afraid to call us. That would create unsafe communities, not just in immigrant or refugee communities, but really for the entire city. And we can't have that. So we continually stress the need for partnerships. Do we cooperate with ICE in their enforcement of immigration? No, we don't. But would we hinder from doing their ability? We can't do that either. We have to work with all of our law enforcement partners at the state, local, and federal levels. But again, that is their responsibility. They do notify us that they are taking some sort of action. They don't tell us what the action is, but we have to do that to maintain deconfliction, so that if we do get calls, they call for assistance because they're in an emergency situation, we have to know where they are. But it is just a notification. It is not us going to assist them in doing their job.
Okay. Very good. So, Nicole, let's go to the second question. And we only have about 15 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you all to be as concise as possible. But you had mentioned some of the things that you see happening. What is happening now, as far as activities to address those pressing issues that you see emerging throughout the state?
I think there's mass mobilization of folks to know your rights. Obviously, we talked about that. We're launching a hotline in rapid response form to have bystanders help be able to support folks who are experiencing or know of ICE raids happening, so that those folks who are in those situations have sort of auditors and support from community members as they're going through that process. We do have a response hotline that's a separate part of that work that is for folks when they have had an infraction with local police. We're sort of documenting where that happens and if there's a trend and pattern, why that might be happening, so that we can see, get to the bottom of why that may be happening in a particular city, and that informs our policy work with all of our Sheriff Association and with our partners at the ACLU and Together Colorado and many other folks that are here with us today. I think the other thing that's happening is there's a groundswell from the folks who want to support us in making calls to their congressional delegation around budget spending and dollars allocated for enforcement measures that are unprecedented in our nation's history. And I think, there's a lot of folks who are ready to kind of hold our elected officials to a higher standard and sort of standing up to things that sort of don't resonate with our values as Coloradans.
Thank you. What about you, Celeste? What are maybe even your Together Colorado? I mean, what's some of the activities going on to address some of these pressing issues that you talked about?
Yeah, well, we've seen a groundswell of congregations with interest in community organizing, which is always really exciting. So we're really trying to engage many more congregations and train faith leaders as well as leaders in their communities to know how to take a moral stance against the injustices that are impacting our community across the board, whether it's education or economic injustice or mass incarceration. And one of the other things as well, just to echo what Nicole has already uplifted, in our partnership with CERC, the ACLU, and many other folks as part of the Immigrant Resistance Table, we've been working really hard to formulate trainings for individuals in the community to know how to document, legally observe, and learn about how immigration is acting in enforcement, because their behaviors are much different than we saw during the Obama administration, really since 2006. And so we're trying our best to understand what are some of the behaviors of ICE in our communities. Is there collaboration with law enforcement? Is there opportunities for us as community organizations to work with city agencies to pass laws that allow for our law enforcement to serve and protect our communities and do their job, so they don't have to collaborate as much with federal agencies? So these are all questions that we've been working on very intentionally, and there'll be plenty of action opportunities for you to engage in. You can just join one of our listservs, or I'm happy to give you my card. But those are some of the aspects in which we've really been moving forward with, as well as continuing to be committed to our long-term organizing to keep our families together.
Melissa.
So we've been doing everything from educating our elected officials on the refugee resettlement process, on how budgeting wraps into our federal budgeting process, and of course on just the fact that refugees add so much value to our communities. With the refugee community, we have had Know Your Rights sessions. We have had civics lessons and understanding how our government functions and our checks and balances. We've also been ramping up our programming around psychosocial supports. In a time like this, we've noticed just mental health being of one of our greater concerns. So psychosocial supports, typically for women, is where we've been doubling down. So we have a social enterprise called We Made This, and it focuses on teaching the technical skill of sewing, but also in building confidence and building social connections, social bonds, bridging with other communities. And we've found that those are real indicators of integration into a community and will ultimately make refugees feel safer. So we've been expanding that type of programming as well.
Thank you. Chief, activities DPD has been doing.
So we do a lot of community outreach. Last year, the last figures I saw for 2016, we had 600,000 police community contacts or interactions. That includes people calling us for a call for service, or positive, proactive contacts with the police. And as far as the proactive contacts, which was what we encourage officers to engage the community in, that went up 65,000 from 15 to 16. And it resulted in fewer arrests, which is a good thing for our community engagement. So we really push the officers to not just look for opportunities to stop a crime, to solve a crime, but to look for opportunities to interact with the community. And it's not just community meetings. We didn't get to where we got as a result of certain police actions that happened over the past few years that were captured. Really, we got there over the way policing was done for years and years and years. And we try to tell officers, it's not a transactional contact. Here's your ticket, go on your way, here's your report. Really, we're looking for transformational contacts where we can engage the community, explain what we're doing, why we're doing it. And I think that's going to make us a better community as a whole, because we're just part of the community. We're a small part of the community, but we are just part of the community.
So last question, and then we'll go to some of the audience questions, is from your perspective, what else do you, when you're talking about what you're seeing and what you're doing, what else needs to happen that isn't happening now?
I think folks need to really look for leadership of our municipal leaders, our councils, commissioners, our local sheriffs, and really get involved and tell them why this issue would be important to you, and lift up the stories of folks who are directly impacted by this issue, our neighbors, our friends, our children's friends. I think having community conversations one-on-one is definitely always helpful. I think the other thing that needs to happen is, just that increased and continuing coordination as we continue to see what shakes out in the next 3 years. I know that, the wave that we've been riding for the past 6 months within this work is just unprecedented, fury of trying to get out there as much as we can. And so if there's a way to lean on community partners and train the trainer models so that within your own programs you all can implement some of this programming so that we can really, we have 168,000 families to reach, we need your help, is really something that we need to take to scale.
Celeste, what else needs to happen?
I would say in the long term for Colorado, our state has an opportunity that's really exciting when it comes to universal health care and establishing that system. And that has everything to do in relation to immigrant rights and to immigrant and refugee families. A lot of the work that we have done over the past couple of years has been an examination and understanding, healthcare access for communities. A lot of our work in healthcare is based in Aurora, the most diverse city in our state. And one of the issue cuts that a congregation I work with that they landed on was not access to healthcare facilities, but affordable healthcare. And so it's important for us to think about that as Coloradans as we look forward into the future for organizing, how we are able to establish a system that provides access to all Colorado residents no matter their documentation status. Another leader in the community I work with is going blind. She's a mother of 4 children. She's been here for over 10 years in our community, and she cannot receive a cornea transplant that she desperately needs because of no means of access to health care. And that is a serious issue. That as well is life or death for their family. And so I think in the long term we also have to think as well about how mental health is a part of a healthcare system for Colorado as well.
Very good. Melissa.
I hope we'll continue to hear a very strong voice from Americans in favor of more refugees coming to the United States. And we heard earlier that up to 200,000 refugees have come to the United States in one fiscal year. This year we're looking at numbers closer to 50, 60,000. And I'm hopeful that that will go back up. There are 21 million refugees across the world. many living in refugee camps, many who have been in camps or have been refugees for more than a decade in most cases. And so I hope that the United States will continue to take a strong humanitarian approach to this across and be an example for the world, I think is my real hope. And here locally, I hope that the community continues to embrace and welcome refugees and immigrants. That's what we've seen, and it's been wonderful, I think, as a service provider to see the community really rallying around us. So I think as simple as welcoming someone who may be an immigrant, saying hello to them, having dinner with them, things of this sort make a huge difference and go a really long way.
Chief.
So we need to continue our community outreach efforts. When we see statistics coming out of Houston or Los Angeles that they're seeing a 25% reduction in crime reporting in Latino communities, that's troubling to us. We started looking at our statistics immediately when we heard those. We don't see that, and I attribute that to really the work of the officers and the outreach that we have. I believe there is trust in the community. We just need to, but I also understand there's fear and anxiety. We need to just continue to build on that trust to calm that fear. And like I said, it's not going to be one meeting or one program. It's going to be the police contacts that we make. When we have a contact with somebody who's undocumented and they see that we don't question them about their immigration status, I think the word will spread, and that needs to continue. But we will continue to monitor to make sure that we don't tip those scales and that we have a community that's fearful of calling us.
Very good.